Did you know that the American dream, which was supposed to be a symbol of prosperity and home ownership, is actually linked to a policy that brought millions of families to the brink of financial ruin? This story begins with a dream of progress but ends in a crisis. In the 1950s, the U.S. government made a decision that seemed to be for a better future, but this decision left wounds that have not healed to this day. This is the story of the destructive legacy of housing policies. After World War II, there was a wave of hope in America. Soldiers were returning home, industries were booming, and the slogan, "Own a home," had become the headlines of every newspaper. America was building a new dream. But no one could see the cracks hidden under this dream. These cracks became so deep over time that the entire system was shaken. Today we are going to hear the story of these same cracks. The housing market is not just a business of houses, and it was the backbone of the American economy. But when policies are biased toward a certain class, the foundations weaken. In the 1950s, the government launched a planned prosperity. Under this, suburban settlements were built outside urban areas, but behind this development was a silent division. After the war, America was in dire need of housing. Millions of soldiers returned, marriages increased, and a new middle class began to emerge. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, decided to guarantee loans so that ordinary citizens could also buy homes. It was a revolutionary step, but its principles laid the foundation for disaster, because this policy was not for everyone, but only for some people. According to the FHA policy, banks were allowed to lend in certain areas. These areas were marked with colors as safe or risky. This process was called redlining, and it was the basis for the greatest discrimination. Where there was a white majority, loans were readily available, while areas with black or racial minorities were ignored as dangerous. This policy divided American society into two parts. On one side were the prosperous suburban neighborhoods where white families settled. On the other side were the older areas of the city where investment had stopped. The result was that the urban core slowly began to decline. This was the moment when the dream of progress turned into the nightmare of racial segregation. William Levitt was a famous builder who introduced housing schemes like Levittown. These settlements consisted of modern, beautiful, and low-cost homes. But the condition was that only white Americans could live here. Black families were not allowed to legally buy a home. Thus, the American dream became a white dream. This new alliance between the government, banks, and private construction companies was strengthened. Each new suburban project was built for the white middle class, while minorities were forced to live in the old cities. This increased the difference in real estate values, and this difference later became the root of the housing market collapse. The effects of redlining were not limited to housing. It also affected education, health, and employment opportunities. Because where investment stopped, schools and businesses also declined. It was a silent but powerful racial segregation, what was called policy in the legal sense. In the 1950s, as white families moved to the suburbs, empty homes began to grow in cities. Commercial areas began to be deserted. Property values fell and crime increased. Thus began the era of urban decay. The federal government knew all this, but its own plans could not stop this decline. Because the system was built into the very structure of the system. The FHA form would have said, racial stability in the area concerned must be ensured. That is, if non-white people settled there, the loan would not be available. This was not the law, but it had become policy. At the same time, banks created new schemes to protect their interests. They began lending to low-income buyers at higher interest rates. This was the initial concept of the subprime mortgage. That is, the risk was transferred to the common citizen in order to increase profits. This same seed later sprouted in the 2008 financial crisis. In the 1970s, poverty and crime had increased in urban areas. Industries were moving to the suburbs. Only the low-income classes were left in the urban center. The government launched urban redevelopment projects several times, but the capital went to where there was already prosperity. An interesting fact is that by the 1980s, 70% of white families in America owned their homes, while this rate was less than 40% among black Americans. In other words, the ticket to the American dream was determined by skin color. These figures still speak volumes today. Historian Richard Rothstein writes in his book, The Color of Law, that all this was not accidental discrimination. Rather, it was a conscious, systematic policy aimed at keeping the social structure under control. That is, the government itself was behind racial segregation. It was one of the greatest moral failures in American history. According to Rothstein, the government did not just sit back and watch, but played an active role. The FHA guidelines clearly stated that racial uniformity was essential to property values. That is, a phrase that turned discrimination into policy, and then it became economic reality. Some experts say that this policy was not based solely on race, but on economic risk. But the fact is that economic risk was also linked to race, because racial minorities were already disadvantaged. Thus, an economic excuse actually became a shield for racial discrimination. When the civil rights movement arose in the 1960s, this issue also became part of the protest. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was passed, which banned redlining. But by then, the damage had been done. Thousands of communities were trapped in poverty and discrimination. Here is an interesting paradox. On one hand, the government was talking about equality. On the other other hand, the banks and capitalists were following the old path. The law changed, but the thinking remained the same. And without a change in the system, the law remained ineffective. In the 1970s and 1980s, homeownership was promoted again. But now the goal was not social, but economic. The government wanted people to borrow, buy houses, and get the economy going. This is when the housing market began to bloom dangerously again. Once again, the foundation was weak. When the Reagan era began in 1980, the slogan of free markets began to resonate. The government gave more freedom to private institutions in the housing sector. Regulation on banks was reduced, and the doors to increasing profits were opened. This is when risky loans in the name of financial engineering began to become common, and the housing market was again caught in the trap of an artificial prosperity. Now it was easy to get loans, even if the income was low. Banks gave houses even to buyers who had difficulty repaying the loans. They were called subprime or low-quality loans, but everything looked legal on paper. In reality, a new cycle of destruction had begun. In the 1980s, large financial institutions like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac emerged. Their goal was to facilitate homebuyers. But these institutions turned millions of loans into investment vehicles. These were called mortgage-backed securities, which prepared the ground for the coming crisis. Now, banks did not hold the risk by lending. They sold these loans to other investors. That is, the profit was the bank, and the risk was someone else. This system was apparently developed, but had become hollow from the inside. Everyone was chasing profits. No one was concerned about sustainability. The U.S. economy was booming in the 1990s. The rise of technology convinced people that growth was unstoppable. Housing prices began to rise, and buying a house became the safest investment. People began to borrow money on credit, and the system did not stop them, but rather pushed them further. Every new house, every new loan was considered a success for the economy. The newspapers wrote, "If you don't have a house, you're left behind." This was the mentality that was born from the policies of the 1950s. Housing was no longer just a necessity, but a competition. A competition in which everyone was going to lose. By the early 2000s, the volume of subprime loans had increased to dangerous levels. Banks were repeating the same mistake that policymakers made in the 50s, sacrificing the future for short-term gains. Every new house was tied to a loan. People thought prices would always go up, but history has always taught the same lesson. Every bubble bursts. By 2005, the housing market was at its peak. Ordinary people were investing in real estate as if it would never collapse. TV shows, newspapers, and advertisements all were shouting the same slogan, "Buy now, pay later," but no one knew that. This dream was about to turn into a terrible reality. Disaster was knocking on the door. The signs began to appear in 2006. Borrowers began to default on their mortgages. Home prices began to fall, and banks began to pile up foreclosed homes. Investors panicked. One by one, major institutions began to collapse. In 2008, the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers shook the entire system. Markets around the world shook. The U.S. government had to intervene to prevent the system from collapsing completely. It was the same housing crisis that shook the global economy, and its seeds were sown in the policies of the 1950s. Now the question is, what is the connection between the policies of the 1950s and the crisis of 2008? The answer is simple but bitter. Both involved misplaced priorities. See, the first era, race and class were the foundation, and in the second, greed and profit. Both unbalanced the system. Redlining divided people, and subprime mortgages destroyed everyone. It was a historical continuum. First discrimination, then exploitation. First some were excluded, then everyone was dragged in and pushed down. Historian Rothstein and others say that America institutionalized inequality through policy. Maps from the 1950s still exist today, with red lines showing which areas were neglected. And amazingly, those same areas are still economically disadvantaged today. This is not just history, it is the reality of today. If you look at property values in America today, the same areas that were red zones in the 1950s are still considered cheap and unsafe. This proves that the policies of the past are ruling the present, and perhaps they will hold the future in their grip. Many economists say that if the government had made policies based on equality back then, neither the urban decline of the 1970s nor the financial crisis of 2008 would have happened, because an unfair system always eats itself up. But the story doesn't end there. When the government gave relief packages after 2008, once again the big companies benefited. Ordinary people whose homes were confiscated were left behind. It was a painful repetition of history. Many black families said, "We had saved for generations, and a crisis took it all away." These were the same people who didn't get a chance in 1950. That is, those who were stopped by the system first were swallowed by the system later. This is a moment of reflection for history buffs. Policy is not always judged by intention, but by its effects. If a policy increases inequality, then no matter how progressive it may seem, it has failed. Some economists introduced a new term after 2010, housing justice, where the idea was that the right to housing should be based not only on wealth, but also on equality. New laws have been passed, but the practice is still inadequate, because the system is still operating on the same principles, where profit is more important than people. In America, housing apartheid still exists in many cities today. The same racial and class divisions that began in the 1950s are still reflected reflected in housing prices and loans today. That is, history has not changed, only the faces have changed. The principles are the same. If you are wondering why a policy from 1950 is important today, remember that history never fades. It repeats itself. Every new policy is an echo of old principles, and unless the system is based on justice, disaster is always one step away. Housing is not just bricks and mortar. It is an economic philosophy, a social promise. That promise was broken in 1950, and in 2008 its pieces were scattered all over the world. The question now is, have we learned anything from it? Every generation has dreamed of its own American dream, but some dreams have come true and some have become nightmares. White families have become wealthy, minorities have been left behind, and this disparity is still visible on the housing map today. When a young person goes to buy a home today, he or she is actually fighting a century-old system. A system built on debt, interest, and discrimination. This battle is not over yet. This is just the beginning of another era. The American housing market crisis teaches us a global lesson, that if there is no equality in economic policy, then prosperity also becomes inequality. The path to progress passes through justice, not exploitation. And this is the point that the story of 1950 teaches us. Every nation that hides differences in its policies eventually collapses under its own weight. Policies are judged not by intention, but by effect. The housing policies of 1950 may have been designed for the dream of progress, but they erected a wall of racial discrimination and economic inequality. So the question is today's world not a continuation of these same policies? Have we really learned anything from history? Or are we standing on the brink of a new crisis and just waiting for the wall to fall?